Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Always remember that all you have to do is press the CC button to be able to follow along with the words if you would like to read along with us. I think that Madam Owl will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Are you ready to jump in? Alright, let's begin. The Midnight Duel. Harry had never believed he would meet a boy he hated more than Dudley, but that was before he met Draco Malfoy. Still, first-year Gryffindors only had potions with the Slytherins, so they didn't have to put up with Malfoy much. Or at least, they didn't until they spotted a notice pinned up in the Gryffindor common room that made them all groan. Flying lessons would be starting on Thursday, and Gryffindor and Slytherin would be learning together. Typical, said Harry darkly. Just what I always wanted, to make a fool of myself on a broomstick in front of Malfoy. He had been looking forward to learning to fly more than anything else. You don't know that you'll make a fool of yourself, said Ron reasonably. Anyway, I know Malfoy's always going on about how good he is at Quidditch. I bet he's all talk. Malfoy did talk about flying a lot. He complained loudly about first years never getting on the house Quidditch teams and told long, boastful stories that always seemed to end with him narrowly escaping muggles in helicopters. He wasn't the only one, though. The way Seamus Finnegan told it, he spent most of his childhood zooming around the countryside on a broomstick. Even Ron would tell anyone who'd listen about the time he'd almost hit a hang glider on Charlie's old broom. Everyone from the wizarding families talked about Quidditch constantly. Ron had already had a big argument about Dean Thomas, who'd shared dormitory about soccer. Ron couldn't see what was exciting about a game with only one ball where no one was allowed to fly. Harry had caught Rod prodding Dean's poster with West Ham's soccer team, trying to make the players. Neville had never been on a broomstick in his life, because his grandmother had never let him near one. Privately, Harry felt that was for a good reason, because Neville managed to have an extraordinary amount of accidents, even with both feet on the ground. Hermione Granger was almost as nervous about flying as Neville was. There was something you couldn't learn by heart out of a book. Not that she hadn't tried. At breakfast on Thursday, she bored them all stupid with flying tips she'd gotten out of the library called Quidditch Through the Ages. Neville was hanging on to her every word, desperate for anything that might help him hang on to his broomstick later. But everyone else was very pleased when Hermione's lecture was interrupted by the arrival of mail. Harry hadn't had a single letter since Hagrid's note. Something that Malfoy had been quick to notice, of course. Malfoy's eagle owl was always bringing him packages of sweets from home, which he opened gloatingly at the Slytherin table. A barn owl brought Neville a small package from his grandmother. He opened it excitingly and showed them a small glass ball the size of a small marble, which seemed to be filled with white smoke. "It's a Remember-All," he explained. "Gran knows I forget things. This tells you if there's something you've forgotten to do. Look, you hold it tight and it turns red if..." Oh, his face fell, because the Remember-All had suddenly grown scarlet. "You've forgotten something." Neville was trying to remember what he had forgotten when Draco Malfoy, who was passing the Gryffindor table, snatched the Remember-All out of his hands. Harry and Ron jumped to their feet. They were half hoping for a reason to fight Malfoy, but Professor McGonagall, who spot trouble quicker than any teacher in the school, was there in a flash. "What is going on?" "Malfoy's got my Remember-All, Professor." Scowling, Malfoy quickly dropped the Remember-All back on the table. "Just looking," he said, and he slipped away with Crabbe and Goyle behind him. At 3:30 that afternoon, Harry, Ron, and the other Gryffindors hurried from their front seats onto the grounds for their first flying lesson. It was a clear, breezy day, and the glass ripped under their feet as they marched down the sloping lawns towards a smooth, flat lawn on the opposite side of the grounds to the Forbidden Forest, whose trees were swaying darkly in the distance. The Slytherins were already there, and so were 20 broomsticks lying in neat rows on the ground. Harry had heard Fred and George Weasley complain about the school broomsticks, saying that some of them started to vibrate when you flew too high or always flew slightly to the left. Their teachers, Madam Hooch, arrived. She was short, gray hair, and yellow eyes like a hawk. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she barked. "Everyone stand by your broomstick. Come on. Hurry up." Harry glanced down at his broom. It was old, and some of the twigs stuck out of odd angles. "Stick out your right hand over the broom," called Madam Hooch at the front, "and say, 'Up.'" "Up!" everyone shouted. Harry's broom jumped into his hand at once, but it was one of the few that did. Hermione Granger simply rolled on the ground, and Neville's hadn't moved at all. Perhaps brooms, like horses, could tell when you're afraid, thought Harry. There was a quiver in Neville's voice that only too clearly he wanted to keep his feet on the ground. Madam Hooch then showed them how to mount their brooms without sliding off the end, and walked up and down the roads, reacting to their grip. Harry and Ron were delighted when she told Malfoy that he had been doing it wrong for years. "Now, when I blow my whistle, kick off the ground hard," said Madam Hooch. "Keep your broom steady, rise your feet, and then come straight back down by leaning forward slightly. On my whistle. 3, 2, but Neville nervously jumped in, frightened of being left on the ground, pushed off hard before the whistle touched Madam Hooch's lips. "Come back, boy!" she shouted. But Neville was rising up like a cork shot out of the bottle. 12 feet, 20 feet. Harry saw his scared white face looking down at the ground, falling away, saw him gasp, slip sideways off the broom, and wham! A thud and a nasty crack, and Neville lay face down in the grass in a heap. His broomstick was still rising higher and higher and higher, and it started to drift lazily towards the Forbidden Forest and out of sight. Madam Hooch was bending over Neville. Her face was white as his. "Broken wrist," Harry heard her mutter. "Come on, boy. It's all right. Up you get." She turned to the rest of class. "None of you move while I take this boy to the hospital wing. You leave these brooms where they are, or you'll be out of Hogwarts before you could say Quidditch. Come on, dear." Neville, his face tear-struck, clutched his fist, hobbled off with Madam Hooch, who had her arm around him. No sooner were they out of earshot than Malfoy burst into laughter. "Did you see his face, the great lump?" The other Slytherins joined in. "Shut up, Malfoy." "Oh, sticking up for Longbottom," said Pansy Parkinson, a hard-faced Slytherin girl. "Never thought you'd like a fat crybaby's Potvy." "Look," said Malfoy, darting forward and snatching something out of the grat. "It's that stupid thing Longbottom's grand sent him." The Remember-All glittered in the sun as he held it up. "Give me that, Malfoy," said Harry quietly. Everybody stopped talking to watch. Malfoy smiled nastily. "I think I'll leave it somewhere where Longbottom to find. How about up in a tree?" "Give it here," Harry yelled, but Malfoy had leapt onto his broomstick and taken off. He hadn't been lying. He could fly well. Hovering level with the topmost branches of an oak, he called, "Come and get it, Potter." Harry grabbed his broom. "No!" shouted Hermione Granger. "Madam Hooch told us not to move. You'll get us all into trouble." Harry ignored her. Blood was pounding in his ears. He mounted the broom and kicked off hard against the ground, and up he soared. Air rushed through his ears, and his robes whipped behind him. And in a rush of his fierce joy, he realized he'd found something he could do without being taught. This was easy. This was wonderful. He pulled his broomstick up a little to take it even higher, and heard some screams and gasps of the girls on the ground, and an admiring whoop from Ron. He turned over his broomstick sharply to face Malfoy in the owl. Malfoy looked stunned. "Give it here," Harry called, "or I'll knock you off that broom." "Oh yeah?" said Malfoy, trying to sneer, but looking worried. Harry knew somehow what to do. He leaned forward and grasped the broom tightly with both hands and shot towards Malfoy like a javelin. Malfoy just got out of the way in time. Harry made a sharp about face and held the broom steady. A few people were clapping. "No Crabbe and Goyle up here to save your neck, Malfoy," Harry called. The same thought seemed to have struck Malfoy. "Catch it if you can, then," he shouted, and then he threw the glass ball high into the air and streaked back towards the ground. Harry saw, as though in slow motion, the ball rise up in the air and then start to fall. He leaned forward and pointed his broom down. Next second, he was gathering speed in a steep dive, racing ball, wind whistling in his ears, mingled with the screams of people watching. He stretched out his hand. A foot from the ground, he caught it. Just in time, he pulled the broom straight, and he toppled gently onto the grass with the Remember-All clutched safely in his fist. Harry Potter! His heart sank faster than he had just dived. Professor McGonagall was running toward them. He got to his feet trembling. Never, in my time at Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall was almost speechless in shock, with her glasses flashed furiously. "How dare you? Might have broken your neck. It was his fault, Professor." "Be quiet, Patil." "But Malfoy..." "That's enough, Mr. Weasley. Potter, follow me. Now." Harry caught sight of Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle's triumphant faces as he laughed, walking nimbly as Professor McGonagall's wake as she strode towards the castle. He was going to be expelled. He just knew it. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but there seemed to be something wrong with his voice. Professor McGonagall was sweeping along without even looking at him. He just had to jog to keep up. Now he'd done it. He hadn't even lasted 2 weeks. But he'd be packed his bags in 10 minutes. What would the Dursleys say when he turned up on their doorstep? Up the front steps, up the marble staircase inside, and still Professor McGonagall didn't say a word to him. She wrenched open doors and marched along corridors, with Harry trotting miserably behind her. Maybe she was taking him to Dumbledore. He thought of Hagrid, expelled, but allowed to stay on the gamekeeper. Perhaps he could be Hagrid's assistant? His stomach twisted as he'd imagined it, watching Ron and the others becoming wizards while he stumped the grounds carrying Hagrid's bags. Professor McGonagall stopped outside a classroom. She opened the door inside and poked her head inside. "Excuse me, Professor Flitwick. Can I borrow wood for a moment?" Wood, thought Harry, bewildered. Was wood a cane she was going to use on him? But wood turned out to be a person. A burly fifth-year boy who came out of Flitwick's class looking very confused. "Follow me, you two," said Professor McGonagall, and they marched up the corridor, Wood looking curious. Harry, "In here." Professor McGonagall pointed them into a classroom that was empty except for Peeves, who was busy writing rude words on the blackboard. "Out, Peeves!" she barked. Peeves threw the chalk into a bin, which clanged loudly, and swooped out cursing. Professor McGonagall slammed the door behind him and turned to face the two boys. "Potter, this is Oliver Wood. Wood, I found you a seeker." Wood's expression changed from puzzlement to delight. "Are you serious, Professor?" "Absolutely, Professor McGonagall crisply. The boy's a natural. I've never seen anything like it. Was that your first time on a broomstick, Potter?" Harry nodded silently. He didn't have a clue what was going on, but he didn't seem to be expelled, and some feeling started to come back into his legs. He caught that thing in his hand after a 50-foot dive, Professor McGonagall told Wood. Didn't even scratch himself. Charlie Weasley couldn't even have done it. Wood was now looking as though his dreams had come true all at once. "Ever seen a game of Quidditch, Potter?" he asked excitedly. "Wood's captain of the Gryffindor team," Professor McGonagall said. "He's the build of a seeker, too," said Wood, now walking around Harry and staring at him. "Light, speedy. We'll have to get him a decent broom. Professor, a Nimbus 2000 or a Clean Sweep 7, I'd say. I shall speak to Professor Dumbledore and see if we can't bend the rules for the first year. Heavens knows we need a better team than last year. Flattened in the last match by Slytherin. I couldn't look Severus Snape in the face for weeks." Professor McGonagall peered sternly over her glasses at Harry. "I want to hear you're training hard, Potter, or I may change my mind about punishing you." Then she suddenly smiled. "Your father would have been proud." "Oh, God," she said. "He was an excellent Quidditch player himself." "You're joking." It's dinner time. Harry had just finished telling Ron what had happened when he'd left the grounds with Professor McGonagall. Ron had a piece of steak and kidney pie halfway in his mouth, but he'd forgotten about it. Seeker, he said, but first years, never. You must be the youngest half player in about a century, said Harry, shoving a pie in his mouth. He felt particularly hungry over the excitement of the afternoon. Wood told me. Ron was so amazed, so impressed. He sat and gaped at Harry. I start training next week, Harry said. Only don't tell anyone. Wood wants to keep it a secret. Fred and George Weasley now came into the hall, spotted Harry, and hurried over. Well done, said George in a low voice. Wood told us. We're on the team too. Beaters. I tell you, we're going to win that Quidditch Cup for sure this year, said Fred. We haven't won since Charlie left, but this year's going to be brilliant. You must be good, Harry. Wood was almost skipping when he told us. Anyway, we've got to go. Lee Jordan reckons he's found a new secret passageway out of the school. Bet it's one behind the statue of Gregory the Smartly we found our first week. See ya. Fred and George had hardly disappeared when someone far less welcome turned up. Malfoy, flanked by Crabbe and Goyle. Having last meal, Potter, he said. When are you getting back on the train to see the Muggles? You're a lot braver when you're back on the ground, and you've got your little friends behind you, Harry said coolly. There was, of course, nothing at all small about Crabbe and Goyle, but as the high table was full of teachers, neither of them could do more than crack their knuckles and scowl. I'd take you on any time on my own, said Malfoy. Tonight if you want. Wizard's Duel. Wands only, no contact. What's the matter? Never heard of a wizard's duel before, I suppose? Of course he had, said Ron, wheeling around. I'm his second. Who's yours? Malfoy looked at Crabbe and Goyle, sizing them up. Crowley said, Midnight all right? We'll meet you in the trophy room. That's always unlocked. When Malfoy had gone, Ron and Harry looked at each other. What's a wizard's duel? Said Harry. And what do you mean, you're my second? Well, there's a second to take over if you die, said Ron casually, getting started at last on his cold pie. Catching the look of Harry's face, he added quickly, but people only die in proper duels, you know, real wizards. The most you and Malfoy will be able to do is send sparks at each other. Neither of you knows enough magic to do any real damage. I'd bet he'd expect you to refuse anyway. And what if I wave my wand and nothing happens? Throw it away and punch him in the nose, Ron suggested. Excuse me? They both looked up. It was Hermione Granger. Can a person eat in peace in this place, said Ron. Hermione ignored him and spoke to Harry. I couldn't help overhearing that you and Malfoy were saying. Bet you could, Ron muttered. And you mustn't go wandering around the school at night. Think of the point you'll lose Gryffindor. If you're caught, and you're bound to be, it's really selfish of you. It's really none of your business, Harry said. Goodbye, said Ron. All the same, it wasn't what you'd call the perfect end of the day, Harry thought, as he lay awake much after listening to Dean and Seamus falling asleep. Neville wasn't back from the hospital wing. Ron had spent all evening giving him advice. If he tries to curse you, you'd better dodge it, because I can't remember how to block them. There was a very good chance that they were going to get caught by Filch or Mrs. Norris, and Harry felt he was pushing his luck, breaking another rule today. On the other hand, Malfoy's sneering face kept looming out of the darkness, but this was his chance to beat Malfoy face to face. He couldn't miss it. 11:30, Ron muttered. We better go. They pulled on their bathrobes, picked up their wands, and crept across the tower room, down the spiral staircase, and into the Gryffindor room. A few embers were still glowing in the fireplace, turning all the armchairs into hunched black shadows. They had almost reached the portrait hole when a voice spoke from the chair nearest them. I can't believe you're going to do this, Harry. A lamp flickered on. It was Hermione Granger, wearing a pink bathrobe, and a frown. You, said Ron furiously. Go back to bed. I almost told your brother, Hermione snapped. Percy, he's a prefect, and he'll put a stop to this. Harry couldn't believe anyone could be so interfering. Come on, said Ron. He pushed open the portrait of the fat lady and climbed through the hole. Hermione wasn't going to give up that easily. She followed Ron through the portrait hole, hissing at them like an angry goose. Don't you care about Gryffindor? Do you only care about yourselves? I don't want Slytherin to win the House Cup, and you'll lose all the points I got from Professor McGonagall for knowing all about switching spells. Go away. All right, but I warned you. You just remember what I said when you're on the train home tomorrow. You're so... But the way they were, they didn't find out. Hermione had only turned to the porch of the fat lady to get back and found herself facing an empty painting. The fat lady had gone home on a nighttime visit, and Hermione was locked out of Gryffindor Tower. Now what am I going to do? She asked cheerily. That's your problem, said Ron. We've got to go. We're going to be late. They hadn't even reached the end of the corridor when Hermione caught up with them. I'm coming with you, she said. You are not. Do you think I'm going to stand out here and wait for Filch to catch me? If he finds all three of us, I'll tell him the truth, that I was trying to stop you, and you can back me up. You've got some nerve, said Ron loudly. Shut up, both of you, said Harry sharply. I heard something. It was a sort of sniffing. Miss Norris, Ron breathed, squinting through the dark. It wasn't Mrs. Norris. It was Neville. He was curled up on the floor, fast asleep, but jerked suddenly awake as they crept nearer. Thank goodness you found me. I've been out here for hours. I couldn't remember the password to get into bed. Keep your voice down, Neville. The password is pig snout. But it won't help you now. The fat lady's gone off somewhere. How's your arm? Said Harry. Fine, said Neville, showing them. Madame Pomfrey mended it in about a minute. Good. Well, look, Neville. We've got to be somewhere. We'll see you later. Don't leave me, said Neville, scrambling to his feet. I don't want to stay here alone. The Bloody Baron's been past twice already. Ron looked at his watch and then glared furiously at Hermione and Neville. If either of you get us caught, I'll never rest until I've learned that curse on the boogie Quirrells told us about and use it on you. Hermione opened her mouth, perhaps to tell Ron exactly how to use the curse of the boogies, but Harry hissed at her to be quiet and beckoned for them all to follow forward. They flitted along corridors stripped with bars of moonlight from the high windows. At every turn, Harry expected to run into Filch or Mrs. Norris, but they were lucky. They sped up a staircase to the third floor and tipped towards the trophy room. Malfoy and Crabbe weren't there yet. The crystal trophy case glimmered where the moonlight caught them. Cups, shields, plates, and statues winked silver and gold in the darkness. They edged along the walls, keeping their eyes on the doors at either end of the room. Harry took out his wand in case Malfoy started at once. The minutes crept by. He's late. Maybe he chickened out, Ron whispered. Then a voice in the next room made them jump. Harry only raised his wand when they heard someone speak. It wasn't Malfoy. Sniff around, my sweet. They might be lurking in a corner. It was Filch talking to Miss Norris. Horror struck Harry. Harry waved madly at the other three to follow him as quickly as possible. They scurried silently through the door, away from Filch's voice. Neville's robes had barely slipped around the corner when they heard Filch's enter the trophy room. They're in here somewhere, they heard him mutter, probably hiding. This way, Harry mouthed, as the others, petrified, they began to creep along the long gallery full of suits of armor. They could hear Filch getting near. Neville suddenly let out a frightened squeak and broke into a run. He tripped, grabbed Ron around the waist, and the pair of them toppled into a suit of armor. Oh my god. The clanging and crashing were enough to break the castle. Run, Harry yelled, and the four of them sprinted down the gallery, not looking whether to see Filch was following. They swung around the doorpost and galloped down the corridor. Then another, Harry in the lead, without any idea of where they were or where they were going. They ripped through the tapestry and found themselves in a hidden passageway, hurtled along it, and came out near the charms classroom, which they knew was miles from the trophy room. I think we've lost him, Harry panted, leaning against the cold wall, wiping his forehead. Neville had bent double, wheezing and sputtering. I told you, Hermione gasped, clutching the switch in her chest. I told you. We've got to get back to Gryffindor Tower, Ron muttered, quickly as possible. Malfoy tricked you, Hermione said to Harry. You realize that, don't you? He was never going to meet you. Filch knew someone was going to be in the trophy room. Malfoy must have tipped him off. Harry thought she was probably right, but he wasn't going to tell her that. Let's go. It wasn't going to be that simple. They hadn't gone more than a dozen paces when a doorknob rattled and something came shooting out of the classroom in front of them. It was Peeves. He had caught sight of them and began to squeal in delight. Shut up, please, Peeves, or you'll get us thrown out. Peeves cackled. Wandering around at midnight, Icklefair Steves. Tut, 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 naughty, naughty, you'll get caughty. Not if you don't give us away, Peeves, please. Should tell Filch, I should, said Peeves in a saintly voice, but his eyes glittered wickedly. It's for your own good, you know. Get out of the way, Ron snapped, taking a swipe at Peeves. This was a big mistake. Students out of bed, Peeves bellowed. Students out of bed. Down the charms corridor. Ducking under Peeves, they ran for their lives. Right to the end of the corridor, they slammed into a door, and it was locked. That's it, Ron moaned. They pushed helplessly on the door. We're done for. This is the end. They could hear footsteps. Filch running as fast as he could towards Peeves' shouts. Oh, move over, Hermione snarled. She grabbed Harry's wand, tapped the lock, and whispered, Alorma! The lock clicked and the door swung open. They piled through and shut it quickly and pressed their ears against it, listening. Which way do they go, Peeves? Filch said, saying, Quick, tell me. Say please. Don't mess with me, Peeves. Now where do they go? Shan't say nothing if you don't say please, said Peeves, in his annoying sing-song voice. All right, please. Nothing. Ha ha ha! Told you I wouldn't say nothing if you didn't say please. Ha ha ha! And they heard the sound of Peeves whooshing away as Filch cursed in a rage. He thinks the door is locked, Harry whispered. I think we'll be okay. Get off, Neville. For Neville had been tugging on Harry Sleeve's back robe for the last minute. What? Harry turned and saw quite clearly. For a moment, he'd sure he walked into a nightmare. This was too much. On top of everything that happened so far, they weren't in a room as he'd supposed. They were in a corridor. The forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor. And now they knew why it was forbidden. They were looking straight into the eyes of a monstrous dog that filled the whole space between the ceiling and the floor. It had 3 heads, 3 pairs of rolling mad eyes, noses twitching and quivering in their direction, 3 drooling mouths, saliva hanging in dripping ropes from yellowish fangs. It was standing quite still, all 6 eyes staring at them, and Harry knew that the only reason they weren't already dead was that their sudden appearance had taken it by surprise, but it was quickly getting over that. There was no mistaking what those thunderous growls meant. Harry groped for the doorknob. Between Filch and death, he'd take Filch. They fell backwards. Harry slammed the door shut, and they ran, almost flew back to the corridor. Filch must have hurried off to look for them somewhere else, because they didn't see him anywhere. But they hardly cared. All they wanted to do was put as much space between them and that monster. They didn't stop running until they reached the portrait of the fat lady on the 7th floor. Where on earth have you been? She said, looking at their bathrobes hanging off their shoulders and flushed, sweaty faces. Never mind that. Pig snout! Pig snout! Harry panted, and the portrait swung forward. They scrambled into the common room and collapsed, trembling into armchairs. It was a while before any of them said anything. Neville, indeed, looked as if he'd never speak again. What do you think they're doing keeping a thing like that locked inside a school? Ron said finally. If any dog needs exercise, that does. Hermione had got her breath and her bad temper back again. You don't use your eyes, any of you, do you? She snapped. Didn't you see what that thing was standing on? The floor, Harry suggested. I wasn't looking at its feet. Too busy with its heads. No, not the floor. It was standing on the trap door. Obviously, it's guarding something. She stood up, glaring at them. I hope you're pleased with yourselves. We could have gotten killed, or worse, expelled. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to bed. Ron stared after her, his mouth open. No, we don't mind, he said. You think we dragged her along, wouldn't you? But Hermione had given Harry something else to think about as he climbed back in the bed. The dog was guarding something. What had Hagrid said? Gringotts was the safest place in the world for something you wanted to hide, except for Hogwarts. It looked as though Harry had found out where the grubby little package from the vault 713 was. Oh, wow! That was an amazing adventure. What do you think about what happened in today's adventure with Harry Potter? What do you think, Madam Owl? I really like that part too. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. And we'll see you on the next adventure here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us for another great story. We can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye.